The other thing that I should mention is solo travel is more expensive because, for example, if you want to stay in a nice hotel, there's not multiple people to split the bill, so you'll either
Yeah.
end up in a hostel or a smallerish hotel, and you can rack up costs.
Mm.
So it's probably good to start in a country that is slightly cheaper. One of the things that I like to do and I recommend for everyone is day trips, because that way you also meet fellow travelers. And I met some really nice people when I was in Bosnia and had dinner with a couple of them. Some were also fellow solo travelers, and that's quite nice. But as I mentioned, start small. Pick somewhere that's not too far for your first trip. It could be somewhere that's in the country, somewhere that's a few hours away, somewhere that you want to go, but you might not necessarily know lots of people who are willing to go with you.
I'm Shreya Parekh, and you're listening to Empower Her, the podcast for busy women aged 35 and beyond. If you're feeling stuck and unfulfilled with your health and wealth, get ready to be empowered to take action. My guests and I will be providing you with knowledge, resources, and ideas to help you broaden your perspectives, learn more about yourself, and define your path to live your absolute best life. Be sure to hit that follow button to stay tuned with Empower Her and check out the valuable free resources available on the website to support your journey. Have you ever considered traveling solo? Does the thought put negative thoughts into your head? Or perhaps you feel like it's not possible because you simply can't afford the time or money. Well, join me today with Sadaf Rashid, where we'll be exploring her journey with solo travel, why it's possible for you, what it can bring you, and why you should consider doing it. We'll talk about the fears, challenges, budgeting, and more. Sadaf has been traveling solo to more than 10 countries for 15 years. She is also the founder and director of AnthroNation, an applied anthropology consultancy specializing in the interplay between humans and the digital world. Join us on this adventure. Sadaf, welcome to the Empower Her podcast. It's great to have you on. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today because it's something that I'm super passionate about, and I also love doing. Could you please introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your journey from what you were doing to what you're doing now and why? That would be great. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Shreya, for having me. Obviously excited to be here and delighted. So I'm Sadaf. I'm the founder and director of an applied anthropology consultancy called AnthroNation. I started my career working in behavioral change communications and international development. I bopped around in the tech sector for a bit, the charity sector, and then I found myself in a surprisingly hot summer in London reading Brene Brown and David Graeber. And in that moment, I decided to essentially quit my job and start working for myself, which is when AnthroNation was born, to try and unite the various aspects of the things that I was passionate about, and to break down silos that might exist in marketing, communications, and behavioral design.
That's great. So obviously we're here to talk about the amazing world of travel, and I know that you have traveled quite a lot, and a lot of that has been kind of solo traveling. And I'm really interested in this because as a woman as well, a lot of women, and I know I have in the past, find solo traveling quite daunting and can be quite scary. And then also, especially if you're really busy, where do you start? When do you go even? So could you talk a little bit about why you decided to do that, when you decided to do that, and what that's kind of brought you on a personal level?
Yeah, so I started solo traveling when I was quite young, but not necessarily in the way that people might assume solo travel to be. It was more like group initiatives where you're a teenager and they kind of like send you off to a country. So I did that. I went to South Africa. I did a couple of other short trips. And then in my I want to say my early 20s, I've actually never been a fan of celebrating my birthday. So to escape the inevitable surprise parties, I started to do solo trips just across England. I started small, and it was just my birthday, maybe a couple of days, like around that, somewhere that wasn't too far, somewhere that I could relax and know that I would enjoy my day. And that was essentially my kind of gateway into smaller solo travel trips, but to also get a sense of what I enjoyed outside of being around other people, because I feel like one of the things that you can do quite often when you travel with someone is almost sacrifice the things that you would like to see. So I spend a very long time in museums, for example. But not everyone wants to spend 4 hours of the holiday in a museum when you're in a really nice sunny location. So really being able to think about the kind of things that I enjoyed and then slowly building up confidence to almost take up space in your own trip, your own vacation, your own holiday, um, to really just be, in a way, quite self-indulgent.
Mm. It sounds like there's a kind of thought process behind it, I guess. It's not a case of, right, I want to experience solo traveling, let me pick this country and this location and just go there and see what happens. It's more a case of, I think it's probably, like you said, important to find out what kind of things do I enjoy, what do I like doing, and then going from there.
I agree, but I think it's interesting because when I my most recent trips, it it was a bit more of the former. I now know that I like solo traveling, so I'm gonna go to this country. So I was traveling Southeast Asia. I'm gonna go to this country, and then eventually you become it's essentially a habit. So I knew at that point where I wanted to go, what I wanted to see, the kind of things that I enjoyed. But also, there's some things that you have to consider as a woman,
Mm.
or I feel like I needed to consider as a woman, or people would just in general in terms of safety. And once you've almost got the infrastructure of what a good the solo travel trip feels like for you, then it's quite easy to be spontaneous and like get a bus somewhere and just figure out where you're going to go next.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so I want to kind of strip back a bit. What do you think solo travel can bring you? Well, bring to a woman, and why should they be doing it?
So many things. I think initially it goes back to the self-indulgence thing. I think a lot of women almost socialized to be supportive of other people, whether it's in a kind of a parental role. Um, you're you're almost always taught to take up not very much space, to think about the needs and wants of other people. I think society is often quite damaging to women in that we always for the infrastructure of our society, for example, lots of women don't feel safe walking down the street. It's not particularly it's not particularly fun for a woman in employment. We get paid less, for example, less likely to be promoted. If you're a woman of color, you face all of these other barriers. You might face discrimination at work. I did, which is also part of the reason I started working for myself. So there's all of these things, and I feel like to some extent we start to perceive that as the world because we only have those sets of experiences. And to some extent, it does feel relentless. Whereas, and I think we start to feel quite fearful of the world. And as an anthropologist, obviously, academically and professionally and rationally, I know that that's not the case. And there are people that are amazing and cultures that are amazing and interesting, but you don't necessarily get to experience that unless you put yourself outside of your comfort zone. And the other thing that I think that people it's interesting actually because when I went solo traveling more recently, I've met a lot of women, but not very much men who do it on their own. Um, and I feel like we always, as people in general, we are always almost waiting for someone. We often feel uncomfortable to go to dinner on our own or to the cinema or to the theatre. We definitely won't want to travel on our own. But then we miss out on all of these experiences and all of these things that bring us joy, can change our perceptions, and can really open up the world for us. And also, mentally, learning things is so good for us. It's good for our like the health of our brain. Um, so I think there's a holistic reason why people, and particularly women, should solo travel.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a huge fan of it. And I'll be honest, I haven't done it when I was younger, probably out of fear and lots of other things in the mix. But I have done it as I got much older, and don't get me wrong, I wasn't fearless when I was doing it. I was cautious and I was worried. Maybe there was a reason for that or not, but it brought me so much. I can't explain how I felt, but I just felt great doing this thing on my own. But I'd make sure I'd get home at a certain time and I wasn't out late and, these kinds of things, because that's just my kind of insecurities and more for me as a woman, again, like you said, a safety thing. So tell me if someone wanted to take that step and go traveling solo, what are the first things they need to do? What steps should they take to do that?
So I think obviously it depends on the region, so where you are and then where you travel to. But there are some kind of blanket rules that I always do. They sound really basic, but one of them is always have good insurance, whether that's health insurance, travel insurance, just so you know that if you're in a difficult situation, you're not on your own. Also think I'm very prone to getting sick when I'm abroad. So make sure that you've got, like, if you know that that's your disposition, or if you take medication, for example, have a supply, have more than you need, because there's nothing worse than being unwell because you're already in your position of vulnerability, and then having to navigate a situation or a city that you're uncomfortable and unfamiliar with.
Yeah.
So have those things. Research where you're staying. It is quite difficult. Like, to some extent, these things can be quite challenging when you're doing a trip where you go to multiple cities, for example. But before you go, try your hardest to kind of research where you're going, pick a place, accommodation that's safe. Often they can tell you if there's other solo travelers, and that's a great way to make friends. I try to stay in hostels or hotels that have other solo travelers, that have that rank like highly with women. There's other kind of women in travel communities, like Nomad Her, which is an app, Facebook groups, those kinds of things. Take other people's recommendations, and then, as you say, the other thing I think is really important is actually transportation. So try and familiarize yourself with the transportation of the place that you go to. Lots of cities and countries have apps like Uber, Careem, and they also have like the ride sharing ability, so someone knows where you are. In some instances, if I travel, I put together kind of a calendar that I share with my friends, like friends and family, and that's basically in these on these dates I'll be in these cities, and then if I'm not in that place, then at least someone knows, and they obviously know where I am. So there's all those kinds of layers that I put in place.
Yeah, and I guess you can on your phone as well these days, you can turn the location on and share that constantly so that people know and can see where you are. And there's, apps that let you do that as well.
Definitely. So if I'm to obviously there's some cities where they don't have apps like Careem or whatever for taxis. So you've just got to trust that the person is going to get you from A to B, which I think is quite tricky. Sometimes it can be quite uncomfortable for a woman in general. I personally always like taking public transport, but obviously in some cities and countries that's not necessarily available. So whenever I'm in a taxi, even if it's marked and registered, which I obviously always check, I always share my location.
Yeah. I think that's probably a very, very important part of solo traveling, sharing as much as you can with your friends and family. And it's a two-way thing, it's a comfort thing for them as well. Not, it's not just for you. The comfort is on both sides. Tell me, what would be your recommendation for a first timer? Like, if I wanted to go solo traveling for the first time ever and just try it, what would you recommend that I do, and where do you recommend I go?
The options are endless.
But first timer, I'm scared. I've never done it. I have all these negative thoughts in my head, but I really want to do it. because really we know that when you're scared of stuff, you know, the way to overcome a lot of fears is to do it, and that builds your confidence slowly. So, you know, let's talk, you know, I'm in the UK. Okay, where can I go? Where should I go?
I would say one of the places I really enjoyed was actually Bosnia Herzegovina, because lots of people don't. It's not necessarily like a place that's well traveled. It is becoming so now, but from the other thing that I should mention is solo travel is more expensive, because, for example, if you want to stay in a nice hotel, there's not multiple people to split the bill, so you'll either end up in a hostel or a smallerish hotel, and you can rack up costs. So it's probably good to start in a country that is slightly cheaper. And for me, like, Bosnia was great. I was in Croatia. It's very close. So I got the bus to Bosnia Herzegovina. I had never been there before. It's quite a small country, but there's lots of things to do. And I think that's also quite nice, because then you can get a sense of, one of the things that I like to do and I recommend for everyone is day trips. So, because that way you also meet fellow travelers. And I met some really nice people when I was in Bosnia and had dinner with a couple of them. Some were also fellow solo travelers. Some were just people who were kind of passing through. And that's quite nice. But as I mentioned, start small. Pick somewhere that's not too far for your first trip. It could be somewhere that's in the country, somewhere that's a few hours away. But somewhere that you might not necessarily, somewhere that you want to go, but you might not necessarily know lots of people who are willing to go with you. That was my experience for Bosnia, actually. Lots of people wanted to go, but never found the time or anything. And I was like, actually, I'm just going to go on my own. And then, as I said previously, pick good accommodation, find the things that you want to do, and the day trips. Don't go for too long. Just have, like, give yourself maybe 4 or 5 days, which I know for some people is could be quite long. And always know, and if you're somewhere close, you always know that you have the option of coming back. I wouldn't necessarily recommend a multi-city or multi-country trip for your first, so like solo travel. But also, when you're kind of on the trip, really just mark out the things that you find might make you uncomfortable. So I personally like to get to the airport shockingly early. But I know that about myself, and I kind of mark that down. And just give yourself the space to have whatever feelings you want. There might be some days where you feel lonely or bored, where you might want to go out and you don't necessarily feel like you can go to the opera by yourself. Although I do feel like when you're traveling, or when you're kind of away from the traditional aspects and the infrastructure of your life that makes you, or essentially builds your personality, sometimes you're more inclined to do things that are outside of your comfort zone. But on the days that you don't feel like you want to, then just give yourself that grace. And it's okay to spend a couple of hours in bed watching TV if that's what you want to, even if you are on holiday.
Yeah, I like that, actually. I like the thought of that, couple of hours in bed, no disturbances, you know, breakfast in bed or whatever that might be. And, you know, it sounds like my cup of tea for now, anyway, just for a short time. So, you know, I think probably, I'm assuming, I know for me, one of the biggest fears that I have when I go solo traveling, not that I do it often, to be fair, I'm not an experienced person in this at all, probably done it about 4 times. But for me, the safety thing is a big thing. And, you know, that's the thing that puts me off and scares me the most. What are your experiences? Have you had any kind of negative experiences in terms of safety? And also, you know, that one being a woman, and secondly, you know, an Asian woman as well. What are your experiences? Are they different because you're Asian and obviously a woman as well?
That's interesting, actually. So one of the other things that I mentioned, but I forgot to mention earlier, but it's also a safety point, is social media. So I am very conscious. I don't post a lot of social media unless it's like business related. But I met a lot of other women, and one of the kind of default rules is don't post when you're in a city. So if you want to tell, like, obviously tell your friends and family personally, but don't share it publicly unless you've gone. Because
Like
that way
left.
people don't know where you are. Yeah, like unless you're somewhere else. And it could be a different country, it could be a different city, because that way, if you are in a situation where someone is following you, and they don't know where you are. And that is one thing I think is quite important. From a safety perspective, I have been in situations where I've been felt very unsafe. I'd say more so actually when I was younger. So I had this like one incident when I was in Turkey, for example, that like was quite scarring. And I think I was like 16 at the time. But recently, I feel, and it might be because of age and it might be because of perception, that you can kind of gauge a sense of when someone is interacting with you, how that makes you feel. And it might not necessarily be that the person has ill intention towards you, but if I'm ever in a situation where I feel uncomfortable, if I'm ever in a situation where, for example, I was in a city in Indonesia and I was visiting a palace, and it was really nice actually. And the palace has these people that can show you around. And there was a man who was like, "Oh, I can show you the palace," and I was like, "No," and I waited for a woman. So all of those small things that you do to make you feel safer. But I think also, I do think that to some extent you have intuition, but it's also about, as you say, like as I said, for example, not being the only person in a like don't walk down a dark alley if you can, if you can help it. Make sure that there are people around. Some cities have more women on the streets or more families on the streets. Some don't. And then how I navigate that city changes depending on who is outside, essentially. I would also say it's interesting. I think as a brown woman, where I go and how I'm perceived and changes quite dramatically. So, for example, when I was in South Africa, when I was 16, 17, they just assumed that I was local because obviously South Africa's got quite large South Asian population. So I was fine. I had a great time. And then when I was in Kenya, my mother is East African. So once again, I blend in. So that was fine. I had a great time. And it's interesting because you start to see the ways in which people have different experiences, but to some extent being a brown woman can benefit you. Same thing when I was in Malaysia, for example. Lots of people that I was traveling with in Southeast Asia felt like they stuck out because they might have been white European, for example, but I didn't necessarily. And I do think that gives you a layer of safety. And it's probably because of people's internal biases. People might look at someone and think, oh, they must have money, but they don't look at you and have the same. So I feel like to some extent that did provide me with a layer of safety. But in saying that, in places like Turkey, but also Croatia, sometimes you walk down the street and people just shout India at you. And that is honestly, I'm just like, what is it that you hope is going to happen at the end of this conversation? And that after a while can also start to kind of grate on you because they don't necessarily do it about, like, no one shouts Germany down the street. And I don't feel like it's in a position where people are trying to be like leery at you. So obviously some instances they are, but that can be quite taxing, emotionally taxing. I also think as a Londoner, I'm always like, well, there is that subcontext of always being perceived as other than your home, which does start to grate on you. And I think I find it more offensive to some extent in Europe because also lots of other travelers have these kind of ask you essentially quite racist questions. So there's also that kind of layer. But to some extent, as I mentioned, I also think going back to the transport element, I remember once being on a train, and I wasn't solo actually. I was on a 10-hour train from Marrakesh to Tanger in Morocco, and it was awful. It was chaotic. And it was just because there was a lot of men on this train who
Right.
made my friends and I very, very uncomfortable. They were just basically all standing um, outside our cabin. And it was until the conductor basically came and said, "I will throw you all off," that they all like went down and eventually like found their seats.
Yeah.
And at the time I was quite young. I think I must have been about 18. So I didn't necessarily know that there are spaces in which I can speak to people and those people can make things happen. But when you're older, obviously you're like, this is unacceptable. I will go to the conductor, or I will just get off this train and
Yeah.
find another mode of transportation. And I think that's also, to some extent, that's linked with the privilege of having to some extent financial security and stability, which you don't necessarily, well, I didn't have necessarily when I was younger. So I wouldn't have the option of maybe finding a nicer hotel if my hotel made me uncomfortable, for example.
Yeah.
But I would also say, if you're in a situation, whether it's a hotel, for example, I was in a space in KL in Bukit Bintang, and it was awful. It was awful. And I just left and found somewhere else. And I think sometimes and I'm guilty of this. Sometimes we find ourselves in situations where we're almost paralyzed by a lack of decision making. And because of that, we allow ourselves to be in negative situations for too long.
Yeah.
But if a situation makes you uncomfortable, just try and leave it. Leave it as quickly as possible and find an alternative that you're more comfortable with.
Yeah. 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 I think that's great advice. I think fear is probably the number one thing that probably puts people off. And then the second thing will be that finding the time to do it. And then maybe the third thing, money. So moving on to money, I know you said solo travel, it's more expensive, and I can see why it is, because, hotel rooms are cheaper when you're sharing it with someone, and so on. So what other, I can't ask, obviously it's difficult to get a cost on it because every country has a different cost. But as an example, again, doing it first time, I'm going to do it, maybe just focus on going somewhere in the UK as my first time, because that's what makes me comfortable. What would the costs be, like, roughly? What kind of costs should you be thinking about?
So the UK, I would say, is very expensive compared to, for example, like Bosnia-Herzegovina or even Southeast Asia, which is extremely cheap. I stayed in some really nice hostels in Southeast Asia, maximum like £30 a night for exceptional ones. And I was in this really nice like women's hostel in Bali. And I know lots of people, when they imagine hostels, it's grim, but this was really lovely, and you've got free back massages, and they paint your nails. It was really nice.
Wow.
And that
You'll
was
have to give me the
obviously,
link to that. You'll have to
honestly,
give me the
you
link to
should
that
go.
one.
It was so
That sounds
nice.
amazing.
But £30 a night, I felt like I was like literally, I think breakfast was included. It was amazing.
Wow.
But obviously England is much more expensive. So I would say the things that I would consider, it also depends on the kind of person you are and your comfort level. I know that some of my friends, for example, would never, it doesn't matter how nice the hostel is, they will never go. Whereas some people, when they solo travel, are happy to do like camping, for example, or glamping. So it really depends on your comfort level. And I would say personally, if you're solo traveling for the first time, if you want to save, don't save costs on the things that would compromise your comfort, because that's awful. You'll have a terrible time. So, but the things that you should consider in terms of cost are obviously transportation, the amount of money it'll take to get there, whether that's a train, your accommodation, and that can obviously vary. And then if you're doing a local trip, then you don't have to consider insurance, but the activities that you do, and there might be a specific set of activities that you're really committed to doing, in which case invest in those. But I would also say that if you're going, I would say that when you travel, particularly internationally, but also to some extent locally, one of the things that we all I'm guilty of doing, but also from a planning perspective, is booking things in advance, like quite far in advance. And I found, for example, when I was in Kuala Lumpur, I really wanted to go see the Batu Caves. And on TripAdvisor, it's quite expensive to go see the Batu Caves. It's like, I can't remember what the price was, but my friend was like, why don't you just get a Kareem? It's half an hour away. And you can just go yourself. And there's so many options of doing that. And it's the same thing, for example, when you arrive in a city, you can book the really expensive tours in advance. But the other benefit of me staying at hostels in smaller locations is that they often have a lot of people who want to see the same things. So they group you together and you go super cheap. So there are lots of ways. So I'd say, in addition to, obviously, as I mentioned, the transportation, accommodation, really think about your excursions and if there's a way to do them cheaper, because often excursions and transportation is, and like I would say excursion, accommodation and transportation is the most expensive. And then if you want to save costs, don't eat out all the time. Which I know is obviously, like, it sounds, or have street food if your stomach can tolerate it. But there are other ways that you can save on money. And also, one of the things that I don't do, because it's just my personality, but also when I travel, I don't take, this is also cost saving, I don't travel with a large suitcase, I just take hand luggage, which for long trips does mean that I end up having to sit on my suitcase, but I also don't pay for luggage. So the price of a flight, so for example, my flight to Kuala Lumpur was, in peak season, I booked very, very last minute, was about 400, because I didn't take, or they give you accommodation, they give you travel, but for all of the others, my flights in Southeast Asia, for example, probably like £40 on average, because I didn't take luggage. And there's also, but really think about those things, and just be smart. And you don't necessarily need to buy lots of souvenirs. I know that we often feel like we do, but try and substitute those, the kind of things that you want to buy, like the knickknacks, with experiences. And one of the things that I was able to do with my tiny, tiny bag was just to buy postcards from all of the cities I was in, or small pieces of like art, because that way I feel like I could bring things back that had like memories, but I also didn't have to sacrifice the money, and also just lugging around large pieces of suitcase, like large pieces of luggage.
I love that idea actually with a postcard, because it's just put this thought into my head. When you go to a different country, whether you're solo traveling or not, getting a postcard and writing something on the postcard to yourself, like a little journal of how you're feeling, what you're doing, or whatever. And then, in years to come, you can look at that and read that. And that sounds quite nice. I'm going to start doing that actually. It's really, I'm sure you're doing it, but it just popped up in my head.
That was exactly what I did, but it was an idea that someone else gave to me.
Okay. I thought it was my own original idea. So
it's a great idea though, because I didn't have it. Someone gave it to me, and I was like, oh my God, I've just missed out on all of these like tangible moments.
So have I, but I'm going to start doing it. I'm going to get my kids to do that actually. I think that would be great for them when they go traveling around, or whether they're with us or later on their own. So what would you say are your top 3 countries that you would recommend for a first timer for solo traveling?
I would say I really liked Indonesia. Lots of people go to Indonesia to go to Bali. I didn't particularly love Bali personally, but I had the best time on the island of Java. Because I was thinking about this, and I realized, so Southeast Asia is very, very chaotic in terms of traffic. And I think this is also part of the reason that I felt quite comfortable in the various places I was in. I remember landing in Jakarta, and I couldn't cross the street at this point. I hadn't been in Southeast Asia very long. I hadn't mastered the art of it. And I was only in Jakarta for about 3 days. And at various points in those 3 days, 6 people, random people, stopped traffic so I could cross the road.
Oh, okay.
That was, for me, it was really sweet. And I realized in that
Yeah.
moment that actually I'll be okay.
Mm.
If these like random people are looking at this sad girl who's unable to cross the street, like I will be fine.
Yeah.
But also I made amazing friends when I was in Indonesia, specifically when I was in Java, just because there are so many people who want to do quite interesting excursions. So I did Mount Bromo with people, and then it's also, I think, worth considering the travel routes that people do, because I met some people in like a city, and then we all kind of did the same route, and then randomly we met each other again. And that happened to a couple of people that I met whilst I was on my travels. And I would say because of that, and a country like Indonesia or an island like Java is quite good. It's also not particularly expensive, and there's lots of people that travel. So like retirees, for example, young people, people who kind of younger, I mean, but people who are my age who might want to travel. So you also get to meet lots of people. So I would definitely recommend Indonesia. I'd also recommend the country that you're in, because that's such an easy way to get started. I personally am guilty of not necessarily traveling England as much as I should have when I was younger, but it's still like a very, very beautiful country. And there are lots of really nice things to see, but also all cities and countries are quite diverse, irrespective of how large or small they are.
Yeah.
And it does help you get out of your comfort zone and try something new.
Yeah.
In a way that feels quite safe, because you can, if all else, they'll just get on a train or a plane and you'll end up back in your home state.
Yeah.
So I recommend that. Other countries, I think, for someone who's based in the UK, I think more or less any country in Europe is probably going to be great fun. Because of all of those things, I think I always travel with the lens of an anthropologist, because there's so many interesting kind of nuances and cultural insights that you get from being in a place. And I think the other thing that I really recommend that people do is just talk to the people that live there. I made this, and it's interesting. I feel like to some extent, by the time I got to Bali, because I'd spent so much time in Java, I was quite tired. So I got to Bali in the nice like hotel with like the massages. It was great. But I feel like I didn't necessarily take the same amount of time to have conversations with people. And I feel like to some extent I almost wrote off the island. But then having conversations with people, I realized that Bali is an incredibly interesting place.
Yeah.
Like it's so interesting. And I learned about, they have like a teeth filing ceremony, and the funeral systems in Bali are really, really interesting. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, but everyone is buried, and after 5 years, they're all exhumed for like mass cremation. So all of these like really interesting, very specific Balinese things that I wouldn't have known if I didn't have a conversation.
Yeah.
So I think anywhere, obviously, like as I mentioned, I'd recommend Indonesia, the country that you're in, any European country. As I mentioned, I really, really loved Bosnia Herzegovina. And I say that because the people are really nice. It's such an interesting, I also liked it because it's so diverse. So I was in Mostar, and it was like beautiful. Obviously, a lot of Bosnia has been rebuilt after the war, but it's an ancient UNESCO city. It's so picturesque. The weather was glorious. And then 4 hours, I got on a bus and went to Sarajevo, and the weather's completely different because it's surrounded by mountains. Like it was a 15-degree drop.
Wow.
But it was like so interesting, and because it's quite small, it's quite easy to see like the natural beauty. I felt very safe. The food was really nice, quite meat heavy, but it was really, really nice because they don't have lots of like fast food outlets, and that was quite interesting as well. And it's also interesting because you get to really I learned so much about the history and the geography and also the languages of the states in the Balkans, the former Yugoslavia, And as someone who's kind of on the periphery of that, obviously in the 90s, we knew that there were things happening, as someone kind of on the periphery of that, it was nice to go back as an adult and learn all of those things, but also learn about the cultural similarities and regional nuances of a place that's really not that far away. But also, I think a place like Turkey is a great way to start, because so many people travel to Turkey. And if you want to go somewhere that's familiar, then familiar but also different, it's quite an interesting space. And obviously, you can go as a family, but if you choose to solo travel, a city like Istanbul is great. I spent a couple of days solo in Istanbul, having gone there previously, but I feel like every time I go to the city, I learn something else. And there's a kind of a new culture, more people. And I would say that, as I mentioned earlier, I had quite an unpleasant experience in Istanbul when I was 16, but subsequently I've had quite nice experiences. So I think always, but also I would also recommend that people give the cities a chance, because I think one of the things that I'm definitely guilty of, as a woman, but also as a brown woman, is just assuming the worst, because you just can't help it. You always have your like guard up. And then you go and you realize that most people are really, someone said this to me about traffic actually. They were like, just cross the road because nobody actually wants to hit you. And most people aren't out there to like attack you or harass you. And if you have kind of your wits about you, I feel like you'll be okay.
No, that's true actually. Having your guard up. I can totally relate to that when you're kind of out and about on your own. And it's hard. It's hard not to, given what we hear now in the news and the media, right? It's so difficult not to. And I think it's important to have your guard up, because if you completely have it down, then you haven't got your wits about you either, have you? You're kind of like, yeah, well, you know, whatever, everything's fine all the time, when nothing's fine all the time. So yeah, I guess it's creating that balance of having your guard up but not being too kind of closed, because then you're going to miss the opportunities, the experiences as well, what's in front of you. And then it's kind of, well, what was the point of going, really?
I completely agree.
And
I think I was just going to say, I also think having the infrastructure in place. So I feel a lot more comfortable having experiences and meeting people if I know that people know where I am. Like I said, I've got insurance. I've got a good place to go to at the end of the day. I know how to get to my accommodation. I know how long it'll take, and I know that all of the ways in which I get there are safe. So it's almost like that pocket of uncertainty, and that pocket is much easier to do when you come from a place of safety.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Sadaf, I'm a huge advocate for collaboration. I wanted to ask you if there are any collaboration opportunities that you're looking for right now, whether that's on a personal level or with the work that you do with your, it's a consultancy, right?
Yes. So my consulting, as I mentioned, is AnthroNation. We work in behavioral design, marketing, user research, all of those fun things, kind of bringing together those various silos. Always happy to collaborate and looking for people to work with, whether it's on a particular project that somebody might have. If someone is interested in even like having a chat about solo travel, and obviously, as an applied anthropologist, if there's a particular project that someone has where they want the insights of an anthropologist in terms of cultural relativity and cultural nuances, I'm more than happy to kind of get in touch and to collaborate on those things.
Yeah. Just for clarification, what exactly does that work involve?
So anthropology is basically all about, as I mentioned, really, I mean, we call ethnography deep hanging out. So it's just really about understanding a set of people. And it could be people anywhere in a particular context, or like a local context or somewhere far away. And it might be for a particular purpose. So we've done research that looks at people's perceptions and behaviors about another set of people. And that's really just like, as I said, deep hanging out, really understanding what biases people might have, what perceptions they have about themselves, how they might perceive other people. And then we can create interventions on the basis of that. So a research like this would be a specific behavioral intervention, maybe trying to create content that helps them see another group of people from a different perspective. But it could also be from a user experience perspective. So if you're a company and you've got an application or a website and you don't know how people use it, we would kind of deep hang out with those people, maybe do some like traditional user testing, those kinds of things, and then give you those insights and recommendations for how you can change, make those changes to better suit your users' needs.
Okay, that sounds great. It kind of with the hanging out with people to try and understand the biases and the viewpoints of people, what, you know, other people think of other people. I kind of feel like it counteracts what the media put in front of you, because they give you this viewpoint of a certain group of people, and then everyone, well, a lot of people then go on to think, oh, that's what they're like, and then it, you know, that's how it kind of goes on.
It's so true. And it was really interesting. There's an interesting study in, I can't remember the city, but they famously don't purchase the Sun because of the way that the Sun portrayed them. It's in England, obviously. And they didn't vote for Brexit in the same way that other demographics of people, similar demographics of people did, because they didn't consume the Sun. So I do think that the way, and Liverpool supporters have quite famously the Mo Salah effect, whereas they're less likely to be Islamophobic because of Mo Salah being a Muslim footballer. So I think it's really interesting, and that's basically what we look at, the way that the media can influence people's perception of other people, and how we can create counter narratives that are more positive to try and shift that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that is a completely different conversation that we can have, and I could probably go on and talk about for a very, very long time, but I'll stop there. Sadaf, thank you so much for being on the Empower Her podcast. It's been extremely useful to get your insights, and I hope it really encourages women to start their solo travel journey. I think it's one of the kind of great things you can do, even if you just do it once.
Amazing, I agree. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to Empower Her. I hope today's episode has left you feeling inspired and motivated to make a positive difference in your world. Please follow the podcast and share it with anyone who will find it helpful. Until next time, keep striving for positive change and greatness for all women.